So thank you very much for joining us for this webinar our sixth and final webinar in the series of our evidence-informed approaches to teaching of reading. The focus for today's session, as it says on the screen, is planning and delivery of effective literacy interventions. And we're really pleased to have with us colleagues from Appant Comprehensive in RCT. On the next slide, we've just got a quick link there to the 5 previous webinars, which are now live on our website, and they can be accessed either via the QR codes on the screen or perhaps a little bit more easily by the links, which I will now just post in the chat. There we go. So reading from left to right, we have our first webinar, which was the science of reading, and then we went through phonics, developing reading comprehension, pedagogy for vocabulary instruction, and then developing a rigorous reading curriculum. On the next slide, we have a graphic that you'll be really familiar with if you've accessed any of the previous webinars, either live or online via the website. And you'll be aware that Hollis Scarborough's model of the elements involved in learning to read and make meaning from text kind of underpin the whole series. And today what we're doing is sort of returning to the standpoint of the first webinar presented by Gareth Rain, head teacher of St Peter's in Cardiff. And that looked at the reading rope as a whole, and the relationship and the connections between word recognition and language comprehension. In the meantime, we've explored the different elements of the reading rope, such as vocabulary. But this time we're going back to that holistic overview, but through the lens of intervention and how literacy intervention needs to be designed to address weaknesses in any aspects of the reading rope itself. On the next slide, we're going to start today's session with the evidence underpinning literacy intervention. And we're going to hear from our colleague, Bethan Thomas, who turned to the Education Endowment Foundation. Her findings are available in this video, which sits inside a playlist on the CSC website called Principles of Effective Literacy Intervention. So what we'll do for the next 20 minutes or so is listen to Bethan explaining those key considerations and the evidence base behind literacy intervention. Hopefully this will work okay.
Prynam Darbau, good afternoon, everyone. As Emma said, I'm Bethan. I'm seconded to CSC as a development officer in LLC English, and I've been doing some work around effective literacy intervention and have just published quite a lengthy resource to do with this. So this is just an opportunity to sort of flag that to you in the context of Curriculum for Wales and the universal provision offer that we are kind of mandated to deliver alongside that, as well as the kind of increasing understanding around the attainment gap and how literacy and literacy provision is such a key player in reducing that attainment gap. So the kind of font of all knowledge really to do with this is the Education Endowment Foundation. If you're not already aware of this, then it's an absolutely fantastic resource. Alongside auditing lots of existing literacy programs, paid for literacy programs, it provides evidence-informed reviews around a whole variety of teaching and learning kind of themes. So there's ones on there about effective leadership, implementation, and implementation strategy, metacognition, cognitive processes, and the ones that I've kind of used as the primary sources for this information are these 2 papers here, which are Improving Literacy in Secondary Schools and then also a Guide to Implementation. These resources are currently available in English only, but I have heard just today that there are some there's some headway being made in terms of the relationship between the EEF and the Welsh Government. So they are looking to translate these resources into Welsh in the future. And there was a brief mention there of the evidence-informed teaching toolkit as well. That is available in Welsh. So the Great Teaching Toolkit is available in both English and Welsh, and is endorsed by extension, really endorsed by Welsh Government. So I've used all of these sources as kind of my main reading. And alongside this, texts like Thinking Reading by James and Diane Murphy, which also has now a kind of reading reflection on the CSC site. And all of these talk about the importance of literacy, improving literacy, and the moral imperative that we have as teachers of any subject to encourage literacy in our children, and the fact that if we do not address poor literacy, then we are failing them. And the book Thinking Reading is actually quite stark in the way that it talks about this. But you can be an absolutely fantastic teacher, but if you are not addressing the learners in your room that cannot access the curriculum because of their poor literacy levels, then that is all going to waste. And like I said, it's quite stark in the way that it hits home its messages, but I think as literacy coordinators, we kind of understand that literacy does underpin our curriculum and underpins access to our curriculum. So literacy intervention should be part of a whole school approach to literacy. Quite often you see that literacy intervention is, anecdotally, you'll see that it's an English department's problem, or an English teacher's problem, or it's the ALN department's problem. And it's just not. We're all teachers of literacy, and this should be part of a whole school approach. Now, when we talk about literacy intervention as well, quite often we're talking about discrete interventions where we are removing learners from the classroom, doing something with them and putting them back. And again, this report sort of contextualizes that. So you can see the rainbow diagram, and actually discrete intervention is step 7. So there's 6 stages of provision that we can go through before we get to that discrete intervention. That doesn't mean that we don't ever use it. It just means that there are things we can do first that, for the cost and for the disruption to that learner and to kind of the system, they still glean those results. So it's part of a whole school approach. It is not a fix-all. It has to be part of a wider strategic plan. And as I said, it's strategy 7. So there's lots of things we can do first. So while providing additional support should not be an alternative to investing in efforts to improve the quality of teaching in the classroom, preparing a strategy that offers tiers of support is recommended. So this idea of disciplinary literacy is our first line of defence, and we should be working on that. So we should be thinking about, what does good literacy look like in science? What does it look like in maths? What does it look like in art? What strategies can be used? Is there a consistency in terms of the language that we're using, the terminology? Is there a consistency in the rigor? Because if accurate writing is expected in one subject, but writing is never checked and writing quality is never checked in another subject, learners aren't getting that constant reinforcement of the importance of literacy, and also that constant feedback and chance for improvement as well. However, when that discrete support is needed, the tiers of support is definitely recommended. So high quality teaching across the curriculum does reduce the need for extra literacy support. So we recognise that actually good teaching at a whole class level is the first tier of intervention. And if we make that the norm in our classrooms, then we reduce the amount of learners that get to the point where they do need to be removed and they do need that discrete intervention, because that is costly. And actually, it's not something that every learner needs. But a small number of students will need it. We're talking about learners with very low reading levels. We're talking about learners who perhaps are behind their peers for a number of contextual reasons, such as having English as an additional language or being new to English in some way. And those learners will require that high quality structured targeted intervention. And there are a whole host of reasons as to why that might be. And this kind of talks about that in a moment. So tiers of intervention will look like this. So we've got our whole class down to our small group, down to our one-to-one. And as you go down, the cost goes up, the disruption goes up. So the impact needs to match that. If you are doing one-to-one support, that needs to have a really high impact on that learner. And that needs to be a situation where in a very short period of time, you can kind of get that impact in place, and then they can move back up the tiers as well. And you can see in the red as well, we've got constant monitoring and constant kind of screening of our learners to ensure that they're in the right place. Because quite often you'll see in literacy interventions, either that have been brought in through a program or that are kind of designed in a reactive context, that learners will be pulled out for a fairly arbitrary amount of time and then just put back in. So there aren't those tiers, it's all or nothing. And actually, the research shows that that is not the most effective way to deliver intervention. It's the planning actually that really makes the difference. So tiers of support need to increase in intensity. And what's really important as well is that we're monitoring to see the efficacy of those interventions, whether they're working for those particular individuals, and whether actually they need to be taken out for one-to-one and move back to small group, or whether the small group is enough for them. And ultimately, the message that we hear time and time again is knowing your learners. So you need to really know your learners and see if that intervention is working. And again, this is not specific to English, this or Welsh. This would be kind of across the curriculum. So this is the responsibility of the school rather than a particular subject. So kind of key principles to consider, and this is where the sort of implementation guidance comes in, is having a very clear strategy that effectively targets the learners in an appropriate way, which again comes down to knowing your learners. What are their weaknesses, and are you directly addressing those, or are you just pulling them out and getting someone else to go through either completely different work with them or the same work where they could be in the classroom doing that anyway. Interventions can be quality teaching at small group one-to-one level. So again, that quality teaching can be used, but on a smaller scale, because we know when you have smaller classes, there's more chance for that dialogue, which statistically is the most valuable thing that we can do with our learners, having that teacher-learner dialogue. And interventions should have a clear aim with meaningful monitoring strategies, and the monitoring needs to be robust in order for those tiers to be effective. And it also needs to be done by someone who knows what they're talking about. So, for example, if you're using sixth formers, which I know is a really popular kind of way of using sixth formers for their Welsh back for interventions, fine, but they need to be trained up. They need to know what they're doing, because they need to know what they're looking for to be able to feed into this meaningfully. And this is not as simple as, oh, well, these learners can't read and therefore we sit someone with them and they read. That's nice, but it's not, you don't have that level of understanding about what is going well and how they could improve. So it needs to be something that is given the status that it deserves and has the training behind it that it deserves as well. Delivery also needs to be consistent over the intervention period. So it can't just be a one-off. There's no point, because all that does is disrupt, and it's not going to have that impact. So, and also thinking about from a timetabling perspective, will missing the same subject consistently be better, or will missing a variety of lessons be better? And there's no right answer to that. It's more about knowing your learners and knowing what's going to work for your learners. And ideally, the intervention, and this is where the planning comes in, should have a direct link to classroom content. Because what you don't want, and this is really common, what you don't want is to remove a child who is struggling in a lesson from the classroom, give them a discrete intervention that has nothing to do with what they're learning in the classroom, and they come back in a few weeks later, they're really behind, and they're even more disengaged because they still find it challenging, but now they've got to catch up somehow. So if you make those links, if you have those direct links, which does require a lot of planning, but if you do that, then the impact is tenfold because it enables that schema building, it reduces that cognitive load for that learner, and it allows them to feel empowered coming back into the room rather than feeling singled out and like they're even further behind than they were before. If you were looking for particular literacy packages, then the EEF, as I mentioned at the start, has quite a handy kind of auditing process for literacy interventions. So here are just a sample of them. And you can see the kind of the orange and the grey circles at the bottom telling us the progress that these interventions kind of deliver. Not what they promise to deliver, what they actually deliver. And you can see it's also under best possible conditions. So if you were looking for a particular program, then this is quite a good place to start. But as they say, you do not need to use a specific program if that's not right for your learners. It's more about underpinning everything with high quality teaching, knowing your learners, and delivering an intervention that matches their need. So then it comes to monitoring and assessment, which, as I said, is hugely important. And this is where, again, knowing your learners, there's a wide range of problems that secondary age students might have. We could be talking about anything from phonics and reading comprehension to eyesight and being unable physically to read something on a page. So if you're trying desperately to get a learner to read a book and they can't see what they're reading, you could be sat there for 3 years and they're not going to make any progress. It's about working out, being diagnostic, working out what's wrong so that you can make it better. And because of the plethora of different reasons behind poor literacy, that's where it really comes down to what data you have on your learners, how you're going to screen them, and therefore what you're going to do with that information and how you're going to maintain that information and update it as relevant. So some assessments can be part of regular monitoring. So if you design for your classroom regular kind of quizzes against your curriculum or low stakes testing against your curriculum as part of a diagnostic approach, then you're going to be able to pinpoint where the weaknesses are in your learners and identify if there is someone who needs intervention. And we're talking about perhaps the more subtle cases here because it can be really obvious who needs intervention. However, usually we're able to, as I said, diagnose the really obvious ones. But you can say, right, there's something wrong here, but working out the why is the difficult bit. And that's where we need to be using diagnostic assessments and standardized tests. And that's where you can be also using that data for monitoring to perhaps show progress. And again, what those tests look like is going to be down to your setting and down to your cohorts as well. So 5 questions that the EEF tells us to consider with regards to literacy intervention is or literacy screening rather, is what did the standardized test measure, but also what did it not measure? I doubt that a standardized test will measure eyesight unless you have one that has a section on that. Or, you know, it might not measure some sort of pastoral context that might affect data. So again, knowing your learners, what kinds of scores do we have? How can we interpret them? What do they say about progress? How do they compare? This is again really important. How do the results we have compare to other tests and data? We know very well that learners are complex organisms and we need as much data as we can glean in this sort of context when looking at this sort of thing. So by triangulating as much data as we have, and very importantly, talking to key stakeholders, talking to parents if we can, or guardians, talking to class teachers, form teachers, primary teachers, if we're talking about, you know, start of year 7, how does that information compare to the data that we're getting? Is it an anomaly? Is it a trend? What other things can we find out? And then what is that data actually being used to assess? So this is key because we need this to identify pupils for intervention. We need it to evaluate the impact of our intervention because interventions cost money. Even if we're just taking learners out of lessons, it still costs money in terms of staffing, and also tracking the progress to what we would kind of designate as our exit points for each tier. So at what point in the continuum of progress will our learners move from one-to-one intervention to small group, and then from small group to classroom? What happens if they move back into classroom and we just leave them to it? Do we have an aftercare process in terms of checking in on them maybe 3 weeks later, 2 or 3 weeks later, or maybe at the next whole class assessment point, and checking that they haven't kind of gone backwards again, and maybe we, do they need to go back into the intervention process again? So having a consistency in our assessment methods and having a consistency in our monitoring and assessment process allows for that robust and straightforward tracking of pupil progress and the efficacy of strategies and programs. And this is where the relationship between your assessment and your curriculum is so important, because if you're assessing against your curriculum, then you are directly kind of looking at what your learners are getting from your curriculum, and you can see when it starts becoming less effective for some learners and them needing to start this process. So literacy is a whole school priority. So these are some of the takeaways now. It's a whole school priority. Every single teacher, every single member of staff, from the head teacher to the TA, everyone who is a school-facing member of staff should have literacy as a priority. This extends to intervention. So it is not a particular group or department's job to deliver intervention. Sure, the planning, the initial planning might be kind of led by a certain department, but if you are planning for an intervention in science, then you want to be using science content to deliver that. If you want to be kind of pulling learners out of a range of different lessons, you want that curriculum content. And more importantly, you want that consistency in language. You want that high quality teaching. You want investment in professional learning around quality literacy pedagogy, because that is our first line of defense. And interventions should be used as part of that catalogue. And they should be given the status, the time that they deserve. So clear strategies and procedures for identification, monitoring and assessment are key. And we want that to have quick implementation in order to have maximum impact. Interventions should have clear aims and link to classroom content. Assessment needs to involve some sort of standardized diagnostic testing. We can't just assume that a child is has dyslexic tendencies or something. That's not good enough. We need to know what's going on there, as well as ongoing teacher assessment. We can't negate the valuable relationship that teachers have with their learners, and also, again, across the curriculum. Can't just go to your English or your Welsh teacher. We are talking about across the curriculum because it may be a subject thing rather than an overarching literacy thing. And again, thinking about being diagnostic is really key there. And then using all of the data collected on pupils in intervention programs thoughtfully is key to accurately putting them on the right tier, efficiently using those resources, whether that be time, staff, photocopying, whatever. Using those resources in the best way possible is only possible if we're monitoring them with that pinpoint accuracy. So that's kind of the headlines of the research around effective literacy intervention and what it can look like. So off the back of this, I've put together a step-by-step guide to delivering literacy intervention in a secondary school. And each step has a quote from the EEF, so the evidence kind of backing it, a little bit of an explanation around that, and then some key areas for reflection. So each step has areas for reflection so that you can think about where you are in terms of your literacy intervention provision and what you can do to improve. This is available in English ac yn Gymraeg, and is available from the CSC website, either using the QR code or the link here. There's also the thinking reading reflection on the CSC website as well. That's it. Thank you for listening.
So thanks to our colleague Bethan, and what you've just heard there is her standalone webinar, which lays out the evidence base behind effective literacy intervention. And I've just included on the slide here, once again, on the left, there's a link to her reflection document, which synthesizes the findings from 3 Education Endowment Foundation guides. So the Guide to Literacy, Guide to Implementation, and the EEF Guide to Selecting Interventions. And then just on the right there is the research reflection, which presents key findings from James and Diana Murphy's piece of work on called Thinking Reading. So what you've just heard there is the context and the evidence base behind considerations for literacy interventions. Now, for the second part of the webinar, we're going to hear from a school which has engaged with that evidence, has used and is continuing to use it to design and refine their literacy intervention planning and delivery. So I'm really pleased to be able to hand over now to Richard Young, who, as you can see, is the assistant head teacher and ALN co at Apant, and his colleague Ellie Jones, who is the assistant head of English and the literacy coordinator. And I'm hoping that we'll be able to hear from them because they're on mute at the moment. Are you able to unmute?
Good afternoon, everyone.
Afternoon.
Thank you. Over to you two. Thanks for joining us.
Okay, thanks, Sandy.
Lovely. Have we got control of this, Andy, or can you take us through the slides? Here we go. No problem. So in terms of what we put together, it's been 2 or 3 years sort of really work. We sort of tweak as we go along. A lot of it's against the theory that you're just seeing. But a lot of it was because of COVID and the hangover from COVID and the gaps in literacy from there. Also, as well as our primary schools and the cluster, the area, we are truly comprehensive in terms of where our people's come from. With that in mind, there'd be some areas and be some homes where reading is part and parcel of everyday sort of life. And there might be other places where potentially reading might not be as high a priority. So we basically took everything into consideration in terms of our own model of intervention. And basically, the whole idea was to try and raise the reading ages so they were in alignment with chronological ages of the pupils as were coming into school. That did provide some obstacles for us in terms of once we did some baseline testing in terms of standardized scores. And basically our biggest obstacle was the variety of reading capacity and ability we had when pupils come into us from year 7.
Yeah, so off the back of what Richard said, you know, we've got this wide range of needs for very different pupils, and we started to think about how we could, you know, really take on board these individual needs and how that might work in terms of intervention. So we decided, first of all, that we would think about the Key Stage 3 cohort. You know, these were the pupils who had not gone to school during COVID or had gone very little. You know, I kind of use my own myself actually as a mum of, at the time, a year 6 pupil who missed basically half of his year 5 and pretty much all of his year 6 because of COVID. So I knew that he would probably need help in catching up, particularly with his literacy. And so we really looked at these year 7s as they came into us following COVID and saw that their literacy levels were really quite low. It was quite shocking, actually, in some places that we were looking at 11-year-olds coming in on a reading age of about 6 or 7. Not just blaming COVID, there are a variety of reasons why that might happen. But then we started to think about how could we sort of make sure that all these individual needs are met. It's not the right thing to do, perhaps, to just put everybody who needs literacy into one group. So we started to think about how we could do that. Obviously, the aim is to help pupils to catch up with their peers quickly and effectively. We want them to be able to access the secondary curriculum and fulfil their academic potential. We want them to make progress and to pass their GCSEs. So it's really a collaboration between the ALN and the English departments to think about how we could utilise our expertise and identify our needs with literacy and what the children's needs were. So we decided on a standardised diagnostic testing route for baseline assessment data, and that combined with other data that was spoken of in the, by Bethan in the video that we just watched. It was kind of an idea of how can we identify and link together all the bits of data to give us the best possible evidence for what we need to do in terms of taking that forward for intervention. So we then decided that probably best for us was to help to inform our interventions for groups of learners. We would include and introduce a 3-tiered system.
Right. So, yeah, just as Ellie's just talked about, then just as a sweeping range of data used, we do have a software piece. Renaissance is for star readers, what we use, but Ellie's correct in her assumptions there. We didn't want to just stick it to one piece of data. We want to try to get as much as we can to give us a broad idea in terms of helping us to identify. So our 3-tier structure, we've given it the name Grow, Develop and Expand in terms of the growing capacity of literacy. So our Grow is our first tier, and that's very much pupils who may be screened at a potentially high level for dyslexia. So they would have a consistent package of support, and they might not necessarily exit that particular level of intervention, but that intervention getting them is giving them the power and the knowledge so they can at least access the areas of the curriculum which they're directly attached to. Now, following that, our second level of tiered support is Develop, where if once we have a second round of assessment with new diagnostic testing, should they show a development in their standardized score, they go up to the next level. Following that, it'll be into the third level, third tier, which we called Expand, which just sits just below going back into mainstream. The idea there as well is that when you get to that third level, should you continue to make progress and develop, there's the opportunity to maybe exit the program completely, really, but there's a 2 to 3 week, possibly even a 4 week sometimes, where we keep an eye on the people so they don't sort of, for want of another word, slip back into the intervention program.
Want me to talk through this a
Yeah,
little bit? So just to build on what Richard said, the tier 1 sort of foundation phase for our literacy interventions, and just to make it clear that we do the things that Bethan talked about in her video as well. So we've had lots of CPD teacher training delivered in the last few years to our staff, a lot of it in-house by us as well, where we've really become more rigorous with introducing the idea of tier 2, tier 3 vocabulary and teaching that across all the subject areas, across every AOLE, so that departments have kind of fine-tuned their own literacy development skills in their own areas. So there are key reading tasks in every subject, there are key writing tasks in every subject, key oracy tasks, and pupils are familiar with the language of literacy. We share, whole school, we share resources for how to write this kind of text, how to read this kind of text. I've done, thanks to CSE, I've done lots of brilliant courses, Reading Reconsidered, those have kind of been delivered then to our staff as well. So we all kind of sing from the same hymn sheet in terms of literacy. So we do all of that. And then when we've identified these groups of pupils who really need a lot more help, these are our tiered programs. So in tier 1, in the Grow category, pupils will mostly focus more on decoding and encoding skills. We're talking about pupils with really high tariff literacy needs, like Richard mentioned before, including dyslexia, developmental coordination disorder, those with SPLD. And we're talking really about kids who come to us with a reading age of under 7 years old and possibly a really low standardized score of 69 up to about 70. That kind of marks the entry criteria for this tier of intervention. And then with Develop, as Richard already said, this is the next sort of stage up in terms of our identification of need. So this is a shorter term period of intervention, normally over a half term, and we have to kind of split that a little bit more in the autumn term to make it equitable, because obviously you've got a really long autumn term, shorter spring, you know, somewhere in between summer terms. So we're talking about a literacy intervention of about 6-7 weeks, isn't it, on average? And pupils in this tier will develop and really focus on their decoding, encoding skills. So really focused on that tier 2, tier 3 vocabulary, really focused on spelling and reading comprehension, reading for meaning. And at this tier, there is more of an increased focus on reading comprehension and developing skills to respond in writing. We are great believers of writing and reading within the intervention. It's not just reading interventions, they do writing tasks, they build up to longer pieces of writing, and that happens in every intervention lesson, just like it does in the classroom in your mainstream lessons. We're great believers in writing following reading. But we're talking here about pupils with a reading age of around about 9 years and a standardised score between 81 and 90. So these are pupils who just need that little bit more help and just those few extra weeks of intervention to really, you know, demonstrate progress. Oh, can you just go backward? That's it. Thank you. Want to talk through this?
Yeah.
Shall I?
So and this third level then, these are pupils who successfully sort of graduated through the process, gone from tier 1 to tier 2. Sometimes it's for pupils who have been identified as going straight into tier 3, depending on what they've got in their standardized score. Something I have to say is, you know, in the YouTube clip that we've seen earlier on with Bethan talked about, you know, class down to small group down to individual. Ours is a little bit different, really. Ours is dictated really and underpinned by standardized scoring. We feel that helps us correctly support the pupils who end up in the brackets as we've identified, really. So it's more of an intense basic skill sort of support at tier 1 that develops into tier 2, and finally into tier 3 we will have our expand. So as Ellie correctly said earlier on, so there'll be probably 6 to 7 week periods of intervention, and after every sort of half term, roughly 6 to 7 weeks, and we have another fresh sort of episode of diagnostic testing to measure the impact and to measure the progress of the pupils. That will then inform the movements between the tiers. And on occasions, I've got to be honest as well, we might have the odd people who sort of slip back down into band 2, tier 2, but that's okay, that's requisite, and it's commensurate with how they're getting on. But it's not unheard of for those pupils to bounce back up and then go back to exit the program. So this last tier is probably the closest one to mainstream, where there are a couple of points with a standardized score from sort of mainstream alignment, if you like. But what we'd like to do is we'd like to have a little period of support really for those if they come out of this, don't we? Just so to give them the right tools so they don't sort of feel the need, or their confidence is a suitable level so they don't slip back into the system.
I'll talk through this bit. In terms of monitoring and how literacy interventions are taught, we're mostly speaking here, you know, thinking in terms of the tier 2 and the tier 3. Sometimes the tier 1 requires more bespoke intervention, but we've got some trained, you know, specialist teachers who deliver these programs, and whereas we're using a range of high quality teaching, reading, writing strategies in the classroom, these, you know, are also, we make sure that these are delivered through the interventions program as well. So we all recognise from the EEF research, from our, you know, the courses that we've all done, that pupils need explicit instruction in reading, vocabulary and writing. So that's delivered not just in the classroom, not just across subjects, but also in the interventions as well. Yes, we do have one-to-one reading. Obviously that takes place in the classroom, that takes place in our intervention groups, but we also have some pupils who prefer to work in small groups or with a partner. You know, it depends on timetabling as well. So we try and get it right for the pupil as to where, you know, when and how they feel most comfortable, whether it's in a small group or whether it's that one-to-one. Recall and revisiting prior learning is something that happens in intervention. So, you know, we all know that our pupils' cultural capital is sometimes lacking. So we, you know, the teachers in the classroom, as well as in interventions, will recall the learning that the pupil has done that week in a subject. They'll revisit prior learning before introducing new learning. Word level focus, sentence level focus, whole text level instruction is evidenced in these literacy interventions. We always combine writing instruction with reading in sessions, so it kind of mimics the classroom in so many aspects as well. The ladies deliver a really focus on close reading confidence as well, you know, really getting to grips with a reader's fluency, teaching that explicit vocabulary instruction, reading comprehension, inferential skills. Now, there's almost too much really to pack into an intervention lesson, which is why then pupils are seen on average twice a week, aren't they? About 2 hours a week. And then across that kind of 6-7 week period. And we obviously encourage pupils to read for pleasure. You know, we've off the back of speaking to our intervention staff and to pupils who are in intervention, I've recently bought some books, you know, that they really say that they want to read as well, because if we can increase that reading for pleasure, it's going to increase their enjoyment of the intervention session. Yeah, okay. So yeah, we talked a little bit about what goes on in the intervention session. I don't know whether I'm just thinking about this first bullet point, whether it's repeated from the last slide, but you know, making sure that our interventions teachers revisit with pupils prior learning, prior knowledge, work that they've done that week, so that it feels relevant to them as well. We've embedded very much a knowledge-rich focus on context in reading, comprehension text. So really trying to improve pupils' cultural capital in their reading and their comprehension, because that's so important that they understand what they're reading, not just what they're reading. Spelling strategies, active learning walls are used and utilised in all of our classrooms across the school anyway. But in our interventions classrooms, it's no different. You know, you come in and you'll see those spellings up on the board with lots of different sound words, progressing right through to more, you know, trickier spellings. There are active learning walls that the pupils use within the intervention sessions. Yes, sometimes they're sat at desks and they're reading and they're writing traditionally, and sometimes they're up on their feet and they're using our active learning walls to help them to make progress. And just as we use close the gap activities within the classroom in school across the subject areas to focus on improving pupils' specific skills in certain areas, so do our interventions teachers. So there are lots of close the gap activities that they use that mimic what we're doing in the classroom as well, based on that pupil's specific need.
Yeah, just before talking about this as well, I think it's worth mentioning the strength of our team. We're very lucky. They're very literate. They've got a lot of experience in literacy. We've also got an awful lot of experience in ALN. Invariably, in our intervention program, there were pupils with an IDP with a specific learning difficulty. But the ladies in our team are well versed with lots of experience. So they're very knowledgeable and able to select the correct strategy, the correct approach at the correct time with the pupils, I feel, and that's an added strength.
Yeah, we are really lucky. And what you're being shown on the screen now is just that kind of lifted evidence from the EEF report, you know, that really focuses on the steps that we thought very hard about in terms of how we could develop our literacy, not just in the classroom, but the things that we do within the intervention programs as well. So these are steps that our ladies, you know, take in lessons as we do as teachers, but that their teaching, their delivery of the interventions program is you know, exactly the same as a teacher delivering in the classroom. We are really lucky, as Richard said, to have such highly skilled practitioners on our literacy team.
Yeah. So this is just really, I mean, we all know the importance of data. We know how sort of prevalent and how much it informs what we're doing in terms of progression. So this is just a screenshot really to give you an example of what it looks like. So I've got one from each year group. So basically, we try to identify as many different groups of learners or needs as we can. So within the year 7 cohort, there may be pupils with an ALN, with an IDP. There may be they may be young carers. There may be a host of other attributes or pieces of information about them, which informs the whole learner for us. And it really helps us with that. We have a baseline assessment, which we always start with in terms of a piece of software, diagnostic from a point A. And it just works its way through there. We give reading scores as well as standardized scores, because I know they're sort of closely aligned, but sometimes there is small differences between the reading age and a standardized score. So it's just, we just feel the more information we have, the better informed we are in terms of support and in terms of helping to get across the line and graduate through the intervention program. And you can just, it really, it depends. Sometimes in a big term, we can have a number of different assessments. In smaller terms, like Ellie referred to earlier on, it's pointless because assessment can overtake delivery then. We're focused too much on assessment, not the delivery of the key skills which are required. So in terms there, you can see from a baseline in September up into January, you can see how some of the progress there. And yeah, we're quite pleased with it. And we rag rate and color code as well. So you can see with the partially there, you can see the red, the green, and the amber, depending on the progress they've made. And they don't always make progress. It's pupils are different. I mean, it's not a production line here. As they mature and grow older as well, sometimes they get it, sometimes they don't. But we're not forcing that progress. We're there to support it. So they make the progress in line with their capacity, their ability, and where they are at any given point.
And just to say as well, this is for the whole cohort. So these are not just our interventions pupils here. You can see that we've highlighted, the specific data for intervention pupils, perhaps, but these are our whole cohorts. So the interventions pupils are tested more regularly because we want to know where they're at before they join an intervention tier, and we'd like to know where they are at the end of that intervention tier session, weeks of a set of sessions. But we once a term, so 3 times a year, we test the whole cohorts as well, so that we're hopefully not letting any pupils slip through the net.
That's it. And you can just see there where it is earmarked there already, depending on what intervention they're in, if they've exited or if they've graduated from one tier to the other. So and these are all in Google documents which are shared, so any one of the team can see at any point what progress someone's making. Once again, more or less the same sort of example. You can see where it's pinpointed where they've exited. But traditionally, year 9 there'll be a smaller cohort, wouldn't it, Ellie, compared to some of the other year groups. And yeah, I mean, in a way, that's a good sign as well, because as the years are sort of elapsing in 7 and 8, they're making more progress. They're exiting successfully the intervention. So we're left with the smaller group to sort of see through, as well as some pupils who might be experiencing difficulty by the time to get to year 9. Year 9 might be the first entry point for some of these pupils for intervention, and that's okay. That's what we're there for. It's a flexible sort of resource.
This is just one example of perhaps a focused literacy session. So I mean, it's pretty self-explanatory, but just thinking about what lessons focus on, and you'll see what we have as well across the school is literacy starter connect activities. Certainly in the English department, we've rigorously built these into our schemes of learning, but also these things happen across the school in lots of different AOLEs across all the subjects. So pupils are getting a really rich diet and lots of varied literacy activities that they do all the time across the school, as well as pupils in intervention. Oh, these are just some of the courses that I was kind of, talking about earlier. So I'm sure some of you will be familiar with these. You've probably, probably been on them yourselves. And I found that these courses really helped to inspire me with our ideas for how we were going to develop and focus on literacy here at the Pant. So these are just, some of the courses, as I say, that have really sort of got us thinking, haven't they, about what we can do in terms of our literacy interventions. They've been so helpful. So yeah, thank you to CSC for these CPD opportunities. They've been really worthwhile, and I know there's a lot of good stuff happening in lots of schools with regards to literacy off the back of these. So then on to finally our case study. This was born out of a very good idea and that our head teacher had a couple of years ago. Obviously, you know, we work really closely with our primary cluster of schools, but following need in terms of COVID, you know, we obviously wanted to grab our pupils by the horns as they came in through the door in year 7, but we, you know, and really start helping them to develop and progress with their literacy skills. But we also set about thinking, you know, how can we kind of intervene before the intervention is needed in year 7. So last year, I started going out to one of our cluster schools whose, you know, most recent Eston report had kind of flagged up the idea, the same kind of key things that we found, that pupils' reading ages were not aligning with their chronological ages. Pupils needed explicit instruction in reading, vocabulary, writing. Thinking about how we were going to narrow that attainment gap with EFSM pupils, you know, all these things born out of COVID that you imagine that Eston would address as they come into the school. So this is how we got thinking about it. And I went into one of our local primary schools and just kind of talked with the head there and the class teacher, and we identified that kind of 17 pupils this year I'm working, last year I was working with. This year I'm working with 24 pupils, and these pupils come from a range of all different backgrounds. And what we do is I teach a whole class literacy session when I go in, and then I take for the second hour just a targeted smaller group of children to really work on some of these skills that you're being shown on the screen in a lot more detail. So thinking about word level, sentence level, whole text level instruction, explicitly teaching pupils how to set out their writing, how to plan, draft, edit, making sure that I'm combining reading with writing instructions so that they become fluent and kind of au fait in the ways that we do things here when they come to us in year 7. So yeah, last year I had a whole class session for 1 hour with the pupils, and then following that I took away 6 pupils to work more closely with. This year the intervention need is that I've got actually 2 groups of 6 pupils. So I've got 2 groups, 12 pupils in total, that I then work with on a smaller group basis, I should say. So we think more closely about focusing on reading confidence, fluency, comprehension, inference skills. The idea is to help improve outcomes for EFSM learners. I look at reading strategies with explicit vocabulary instruction. You know, the primary schools are doing these things brilliantly, and we kind of want to make sure that that filters through when they come to us as well. So working collaboratively with the primary schools has been absolutely brilliant, because you can see how they do things. I can look at how we do things. We've got that cohesion between us as well. And again, I focus on close the gap activities with these year 6 learners. And again, all of, you know, everything that we do is kind of evidence-based, with reading and writing strategies taken from Reading Reconsidered, the Writing Revolution. So it's evidence-based as well. And yeah, just wanted to really focus on how we do things here and how we could take that into the primary school and get them high school ready, I suppose. And this just gives you a snapshot, kind of an overview of how the group performed last year. So again, it's been trialled this year, so you know it's ongoing. But last year, every group in the EFSM group increased their standardised score in the National Reading Test at the end of the school year. The average increased standardised score of the EFSM group was 0.2% higher than the non-EFSM group in the NRT, so something was working.
I think as well, some of the softer skills as well, they come in with more confidence. I've noted through year 7, you know, and more ready to access all levels, all areas of our curriculum.
It's still, you know, it's still a work in progress. It's by no means perfect. Always needs, you know, could be improved. We could do things differently. But it's, yeah, I'd say it has had a real impact, just working more closely with our, you know, with our primary cluster school. And like Rich said, seeing the kids' confidence develop, seeing how they are more ready for what we, do for them here. We're seeing, I mean, you can see from the data there, lots of, really nice kind of data, green data, to show that increase in reading age for many of the children. And that's with the support of interventions that are already in place within the primary school. And, even 2 of the pupils' reading ages moved from 2 years or more away from their chronological age to within a year. So for some pupils, we recognise that interventions, perhaps, they make slower progress, but it is progress. Some very much dip, they go up and down, or make very little progress, but for some, it's significant progress. So it's all trial and error still.
In terms of that, that's a good link there, actually. But we're by no means a finished product here. We know that, and the shape and of our program has developed and evolved out of need more than anything else, in line with the learners that we have coming into our school. And I think off the top of my head, if I was to say, we could possibly look to see the progress in literacy-rich areas at year 7 and 8. Maybe let's see if history RE results go up. That would give us a better idea. So we know there's bits and pieces that we need to continue developing as we move forward. But we're happy with where it is and how it's come about. But like anything, you can't sort of rest on your laurels, and we always try and find ways to make it better and improve.
Yeah, even just thinking about how we might do things next year with the primary schools or something else. We're not complacent at all. We're not presenting this to you as a model of, oh, this is what you should do, this has really worked for us. We chop and change our ideas and think about things all the time and what's best for the pupils. Ultimately, we just want to make sure that they can access the curriculum, do well at the end of Key Stage 4. And like Bethan referenced in her video, you just want to see that those pupils come alive and really focus on doing what they can to enjoy school, being motivated. And you won't get that motivation out of pupils unless you take the time to really think about how they're progressing and think more carefully about how you can get them to improve their literacy.
A huge thank you both for the presentation of such a sort of rigorous and carefully thought out approach that you have on the ground. So it's great to hear about the evidence informed approaches and the evidence base from Bethan, but also just as valuable to hear about what it looks like on the ground from yourselves, and not just from a secondary point of view as well. That collaborative approach and that liaison with the primaries in your cluster, and the value that you've found from that. So a huge thank you from us for volunteering your time and taking us through your process in such detail. There might be some questions, so if people do have questions, please stay on the call at the end. We'll just move on to the evaluation slide. So if we can ask people just to complete a quick evaluation, it's just incredibly useful for us, knowing what's useful, any pointers in terms of future requests for support, requests for PL, and just a chance to show our appreciation for Richard and Ellie. So if you can complete the evaluation form, and then we wish you a very good evening. If you do have any questions, please feel free to stay on the call with us.
Thanks for having us as well.
Yeah, many thanks. Thank you.
Many thanks.